Hi, I'm Dan Collins with Collins Fiduciary Broker. I specialize in selling probate and trust properties. I also provide trust and probate administration services. And I spent several decades in my history of work as a land developer. And as the audience knows, I like to bring people on and do podcasts with folks who I work with. And today I have with me Ben Catlin. Ben is a longtime land developer. He also is a retired Air Force officer who drove C-141s for the United States Air Force for 20 years. And Ben, why don't you give the audience a little bit of information about your background?
Thanks very much for having me. It's great to be here. As Dan indicated, I've done a variety of things. Started out in the Air Force, and then I was a commercial real estate broker, and I got hired by my best customers, and ultimately ended up doing the better part of $1 billion of real estate transactions of virtually all types: office, industrial, retail, residential. So I've done a lot of things.
Okay. Tell us about your approach.
So one of the things I realized, actually, I got trained as an engineer in college, and I tend to approach things the way I think an engineer does, which is to try and take the project apart and understand what the component parts are. And then what that does for me is it allows me to put it back together in a better or more innovative way so that the pieces work better as a whole.
So let's take an example. If you were developing a brand new shopping center, tell us how you might approach that kind of project.
Retail is actually a lot of fun. I've done several million feet of shopping centers. In a shopping center, you really want to contemplate why would the person pull off of the roadway into your parking lot, and what is it they want to do there. So, for example, I had one small one early in my career, and I realized that it was a place where somebody who probably had a hobby farm would be driving home after working until 9 o'clock in the office, and he would want a pizza, a six-pack, and a video to watch.
Right.
And the thing was one of the most successful projects I ever had on that concept. Or I did a lot with Safeway, where you would put the Safeway in the center, and then you would figure that while they came to get their food, they would also bring their son to get a haircut. And then they would bribe their son with a game at GameStop, and then they would go to Round Table Pizza for lunch. And so it's really the experience of shopping is the key there.
I remember in my history when I was selling single-tenant net lease buildings and shopping centers that the grocery-anchored centers were really the most popular. Why is that?
It's an interesting question. I think a lot of it is because particularly mothers or anyone who cooks likes the experience of cooking. And so I think they really like to go into the market. They like to look at the produce. They like to handle the melons and create the meal and then bring it home and make it. And so they're going to the market.
Okay. And then how does that feed the other businesses that are in the center?
Good question. So what I found in the places I developed is that very often while they were in there, they would also realize that their dog, Sophie, needed to have something to eat as well. So you could put a PetSmart next door. And then they would realize that, oh my gosh, I really need a case of paper for my copier and a bunch of yellow pads. And so they would go to Staples next door. And then they would realize that I also need to fix the garage door opener. And so they would go to Lowe's, which you'd put across the parking lot. And then they would decide that they wanted a really nice bottle of wine to have with dinner, so they would go to the liquor store. Although Safeway ultimately had a lot of wine, but that's basically how it worked.
Okay. Well, let's segue into about your experiences in the business of real estate development.
It's part of what I love about it is it's an unusual business that sort of brings everything that I find fascinating together, from the engineering, the political side of getting things approved, the customer experience, a lot of technical things. So if you put these pieces together, almost all of the different types of real estate are similar. And so it's a question of really understanding what it is you really want to do with the site, how much is it going to cost, how much income can you generate, How can you raise capital? And lastly, really, if you're going to develop a piece of real estate, you typically own it for a really long period of time, so you have to have a very clear picture, or at least a reasonably good guess, of what's going to happen in the larger economic and political market or environment for a period of 10 or 20 years, maybe even 30 years.
Okay. So in my experience, and I've worked with different types of developers, the asset class that I probably develop more than any other would be warehouse and then office. So warehouse guys, oftentimes, they don't like office at all. So what's that about?
A very good question. Office is really, in no small measure, about the ego of the person in the office or how close it is to his house or her house. One that I remember specifically was the client said, he was an attorney, and he said, I want the office to be ostentatious enough to intimidate the opposing counsel, but not so ostentatious as to insult my insurance company clients. And I always thought, once you understood the real emotional dynamic, whereas manufacturing plants, which are really what I enjoy the most, and probably actually done the most of, is really a job of fitting a shell around a function. So, for example, I built the bottling plant for Sutter Home Winery and the distribution facility, and there it was really a question of, hey, we're going to bring these grapes in. We need to be able to process them efficiently, not have any extra waste. Then we have to process the wastewater. Then the wine has to be processed, and it has to be put into the bottles. And then in the warehouse, a lot of it was the wine is all packed immediately, and then it's held for a very long period of time. And so conditioning becomes huge. So I invented a system which was called the night air cooling system, where you could take the cool air, funnel it across a perfect heat sink, which is a bottle of wine, which is really a bottle of water. And so that was great fun for me, and they liked me.
So that's an interesting concept. So tell me about that design. How did it work?
It was interesting because I was trying to originally, we actually built it in reverse. We built the distribution facility first, and Sutter Home, which they're wonderful people, their question initially was, why do we need you? And so I had to invent something that was intriguing to them. And so they had said, hey, I said, what's a problem you're trying to solve? And they said, we're trying to solve our cost for maintaining the temperature while we hold the wine and sell it off over a year. And I was doing a whole house fan in my house, and it dawned on me that if you put louvers in the walls of this huge warehouse, and you opened them with a computer at 2:00 in the morning, and you drew in the cool night air, and you ran it across the bottles of wine, you could get everything down to 53 degrees. Then you could close all these doors, insulate the warehouse, and the temperature in the warehouse would not go up more than 5 or 6 degrees.
So you would do all of this within the opened warehouse space?
Correct.
Wow.
And one of the real challenges was trying to figure out how to do it under Title 24, which is the California state environmental laws, which were never really designed for this type of a process.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about of the approval process of doing a development out of the ground.
It's actually funny. I started life in high school as the president of the town youth council, and my job was to figure out how to get rock music into the community center instead of square dancing. And while I was there, I would watch the various land use decisions be made. And it was fascinating. It's always colored me, my approach in entitlements, which is there's a balance between the needs of the community and the practical needs of the developer or the tenant or the customer to actually be able to do whatever it is they want to do, and that there's sort of a cycle. Sometimes it's easy to get things done. Sometimes, like it is now, it's really very difficult to get things done. And I think some people would say, hey, let's not do anything because it's so difficult. And I like to say, well, chaos is very often an opportunity if you can use it right.
Okay. Well, I remember in my background of entitling land, I mean, there were projects where neighbors used to literally throw eggs at my car If I was on site, they would come out of their homes and they knew my car and they would toss several eggs at it. And
That's why I have an old car.
That's a good point. So, yeah, it can be a dicey affair. Now, in terms of the political climate today, let's talk a little bit about housing and the approval process for housing. Today in California, we have a new governor, Gavin Newsom, and he has a very ambitious plan to develop over 3 million housing units in the next 5 to 8 years, where right now we're probably averaging about 80,000 new housing units per year. I mean, for a goal of that loftiness to be realized, what do you think would need to happen in California?
That's a tricky question. Let me take a step back and say I was an intern in the Nixon White House. My dad worked on Capitol Hill for 15 years. My wife ran a lobbying organization in Sacramento, helped do the tobacco tax initiative. To some extent, to really answer that question, I'd probably have to shatter a whole number of illusions for people about how government really works. But I like to stay fairly positive. I think, we need housing. We desperately need housing. We're forming hundreds of thousands of family units, and the housing stock is not growing nearly fast enough. I think in the low-income sector, where you and I have spoken before,
yes,
it's going to take some pretty substantive adjustments to really affect the low-income housing sector. The high-income housing sector, or the higher price sector, we're just going to see costs continue to go up as we improve energy efficiency in everything that we build, which is not altogether bad. It's just people want to have houses, and the perfect house for a perfect energy efficient world is expensive.
Well, and I'm sitting here thinking about my history of building, and when I first came into the business, we could build high density housing for well under $100,000 a door, and today we're $250,000 to over $300,000 per door. I mean, how do you fulfill the requirements when the costs are so high? That's the part that I struggle with. And then the other component that I personally believe that we need to see is that we need to see outright allowed uses and to be able to get building permits and development approval over the counter. I mean, if we're going to be building over 500,000 housing units per year, I mean, you basically got to be able to do it like you're buying shoes.
It's comical, actually. If you watch TV these days, you see things like the Jesse Smollett, I think is how you say it, case. I used to build houses in Chicago. And actually, one of the nice things about Chicago was you could always get what you wanted done. It was a question of which government official you spoke to and in what particular language you spoke, whether it was Franklin or Washington. Whereas in California, generally people, there's not a methodology, or there's fewer methodologies for getting things done. But I agree with you. The easier it is to get it done, the faster you're going to get things done. Because basically, as a developer, you're taking a lot of money and you're tying it up for a long period of time, and the only reason you're going to do that is because you anticipate you're going to make a big profit.
Because there's a lot of risk.
And the entitlement process, most people who don't actually deal in this space, as you and I do, have no concept. For example, I had a shopping center that the city we were going to take it out of the county, move it into the city. The county wanted to do it. The city wanted to do it. It was near a freeway. Caltrans wanted to do it. It was an abandoned, toxically contaminated mill site that we were going to convert into a giant source of sales tax revenue. And I spent $2.5 million doing studies and never got the project approved because a vocal minority just didn't want to do it, so they would invent a reason.
Yes.
And that's, I think, the issue you're speaking to, which is we need to have some certainty. I think it's reasonable that the community, having started my life sitting in the city council chambers and watching some terrible mistakes made, cities do need to be responsible. They need to make sure that all the parts of the community are benefited and that the environment is improved. But you have to have a way to actually get to the end.
Okay. Well, I agree with you. Tell me, what are some of the issues in commercial real estate that are important today?
Wow. I'll start at the top. One of the real challenges of the world today is you have to start with the question of what's going to happen to Trump, which nobody knows,
Okay.
And so you kind of are basing your issues around some assumption you have about how is Trump and Gavin Newsom and Ms. Pelosi and all those actors going to ultimately move the economy, because they do affect it. Secondly, you have to look at the retail sector, for example. I'm actually a guy who wrote code years ago. We're just warming up. It's going to be the internet is going to be even more powerful. People are going to buy even more products on the internet, and we're going to use drones. And we're going to people are going to they're trying to change the way we drive cars by using a different metric to measure traffic. The government is now setting us up to want to see buildings to be zero energy, so that they only use as much energy as they create. So you've got the customer changing, you've got the building requirements changing, you've got the technology changing, you've got the government changing, you've got the financial market changing. Some of my peers and you can easily find yourself at a bar wondering why you even do this anymore.
Right.
But I look at it and think it's actually an interesting time, because if you can figure out or get a reasonably good guess of where we're going, it's a time when you can make a lot of money.
So you've always been an interesting subject for me. You remind me of the first guy that I worked for in commercial real estate when I got out of the service, Ned Eichler, who was one of the three sons to Joe Eichler, the big housing developer in the Bay Area, who built tens of thousands of homes. And when I started out in real estate working for Ned, I was working as a loan originator. He had a relationship with an S&L out of the Midwest, and we were a direct lender for them. When he would send me out to look at properties, and I'd come back and he'd say, "Well, tell me about the property." And if you wanted to piss Ned off, you'd start telling him about the property. The way that Ned wanted to hear about the property was you would talk about the bus lines, you'd talk about the amenities, shopping centers, how far a grocery store was away, and things of that nature. When I ask you about real estate, your first subject that you always want to talk about is politics. And I have to say, I've never met another developer who speaks in terms of real estate development by way of politics. So explain to me how it is that you came into that.
I think my background probably has a lot to do with it. I was actually raised in England. If I had an accent, it would be English. And I came back to America with my family and landed in the U.S. school system. I think, in the first grade, I could do reading, writing, long division, multiplication, recite poetry. I'd been taught elocution, and I sat there for about 2 hours, and I finally raised my hand, and I said, "Mrs. Green," I said, "life is very different here in the colonies." Which didn't go well in Alabama. But if you take sort of this background and swing it around, I got an engineering degree, undergraduate, and then I got a master's degree in political science, and then I spent the time in the Nixon White House, which convinced me that my lifelong goal of working in the government was not a good plan.
Okay.
And then I would talk to my dad. So I think politics this is a country of politics. It's a country of laws. And our process is very messy, but that political balance between rich people and poor people and black people and white people, and we have to have that, because that's the essence of who we are. And so I think if you don't think about the allocation of the benefits, you're not going to understand why something's going to happen or not. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and I'm trying to impart it to the audience when Ben wants to talk about the future demand in real estate. Oftentimes the subject is introduced in the context of politics, and you're always asking all of us, well, what do we think? But I really do enjoy your approach.
Well, thanks. Some of it is, a long time ago, I hired a guy who would come from London. And he said, I worked for this public company in London, and we looked at real estate in a 100-year cycle.
Wow.
And it always struck me that really that building I'm building is going to be around for 100 years, but maybe 50 minimum. I need to be thinking of where are we going over that period of time. And I think that there's technology, which having been a tech guy most of my life, I understand that. I can guess where we're going there. But I think it's the politics that sort of is, who knows?
Well, but as you pointed out, and this is really true, you really do take the long view.
Right. And I
Yeah.
think that if you can, to some extent, I think real estate is really a business of being an applied futurist. And so there's the applied futurist part, there's the demand part, there's the political part, and then there's the fairly easy part, which is the technical part. How do I actually get enough KIP support to support a 60-foot bay spacing, and what kind of green saw cut concrete with dowel joints do I need to make it work?
Right. That's the stuff I love. Well, good. Well, Ben, thank you very much for coming on the air with me today. I look forward to doing future podcasts with you. You're always a very interesting subject, and you're a nice guy. And audience, this is Ben Catlin with Bluemont Properties. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
All right. Take care.